So, enthusiasm, I like enthusiasm, but wait till the end. So, I'm here maybe to shock you a little bit. You've already seen a little bit of signs of things to come with water security. I'm going to talk to you more generally about what environmental security is as a discourse, very briefly, and then I'm going to link that into both food security and the big monster, energy security. The first thing you need to know is that all of civilization depends on food. It is an anthropological maxim that people will raid before they starve. And that is the source of most conflict. So when we talk about environmental security, we're also talking about security that affects people, the security of humans. So we tend to use the term human security to distinguish it from national security and those kinds of security interests. You can consider environmental security to have a number of branches that interact with international relations and international development. And importantly for you, environmental security represents one of the key nexes where the geopolitics of populations meets the geopolitics of terrain. It is a key juncture. This is a very handy way to sort of think about it. There are three big features of environmental security. One of them I'll talk about in 2 weeks, which is the geopolitics of climate change, how it is a threat multiplier or a risk intensifier. The stuff that I'm about to talk to you today is the picture of resource security without climate change added. In 2 weeks' time, I'm going to show you how climate change will make all of this much worse. I do actually want you to walk away from today's lecture being a little bit nervous and a little bit anxious. For example, one microbiologist, Dr. Frank Feller, has predicted humanity will be extinct in 100 years' time. When we talk about security in this context, it is a framework known as securitization, which comes from the Copenhagen School. Securitization is a concept of enfolding real-world phenomena within a security discourse. And to do that, it talks about framing something as a threat, framing something as a problem, and then deciding that the way to resolve that is through a military or a security framework. This is securitizing. This is the capstone of this discourse. To show you some of the complexity of this, I refer back again to this notion, which is the climate, food, water, energy nexus. As you would have seen in John's section, there is already a number of interlinkages between energy production and access to water, food production and access to water, and those are almost mutually exclusive. So in order to generate energy, you need to gain access to water. Usually once you're done with that water, it's no longer usable for food production. Climate affects hydration cycles, climate affects access to water, climate affects access to food. It is a wicked problem which we do not have an easy solution for. Hopefully you as bright young university students with effectively going to have to deal with this issue in your lifetime will put your mind to this task. So the first section I'm going to talk about is food stress and the ecological footprint. Some of this is foreshadowing next week on sustainability, but you really cannot separate these things from each other. And here is the revisit of populations. So as John noted, there are three large trends of population projection. We have UN high, UN medium, UN low. I checked the current stats. As of today, we are at 7.420 billion people estimated. When I did this last semester, it was 7.3. So in the space of 6 months, it's already jumped 1/10 of a billion. We need to also consider the impact of population concentrations, not just the sheer numbers of population. One of the redefining features of modernity is the way that people living in cities have fundamentally changed geopolitics. It is less a feature of nations and more a feature of cities. Cities are the dominant social model of organization in today. Cities have a demand for food, have a demand for materials, and produce waste. Where the population pressures are focused, you can see stresses become very acute. So you saw the Jordan River in the previous section. That's an example of how population concentrations become exaggerated through stresses of food and water. And here is a lovely map which shows you a heat map of population concentrations. So we're not kidding when we say 50% of the world lives in Southeast Asia. Now consider that when we look at the Brahmaputra River crisis, and that's water that affects half the world's population. And among them are two potential superpowers, India and China. We have covered the potential conflicts that can arise out of tensions between them. They're both nuclear powers. Now, to consider what the aggregate mass of humanity means, there are two factors that influence environmental destruction: sheer population size and affluence. The amount of money and the amount of capacity that we have to consume determines how much we consume. And in fact, the reason we have, as a species, been so low on our environmental destruction across the whole course of history is because we've been dirt poor. We just didn't have the resources or capacity to extract in the same way, and we didn't have the same kind of desire to consume on the same level. And now we participate in a massive economic system that is consuming the earth faster than it can replace itself. This year, and these are from today, we have already consumed 1 million hectares of forest. 2.4 million hectares of soil have eroded. We have emitted 12.8 billion tons of carbon dioxide and have drunk 3.76 quadrillion liters of water. Current predictions till the end of oil, gas, and coal, at least 38 years, but I will talk about peak oil later, which is hard to predict. The other way to understand this is what we call ecological debt day or Earth overshoot day. So in 1961, across the whole course of the year, we consumed 74% of our biocapacity. In 1985, 114%. So we consumed more than an entire Earth's worth of biocapacity. In 2012, 156%. Earth overshoot day, or ecological debt day, is the day when we have consumed an entire Earth's worth of resources. 2004, that was September the 10th. 2008, September the 1st. 2012, August the 23rd. Who knows when it's this year? Or would like to guess?
August 10th.
Very close, August 6th. Food is largely down to fundamentals, caloric intake. Since World War II, our production globally has tripled. A lot of this has come through higher yields of crops, through innovations in fertilizer, innovations in agriculture, pumping water from underground aquifers, which, as John mentioned, is actually not a sustainable method of farming. But in the late 90s, we already reached a plateau of that. So we're not significantly increasing our grain yield at the moment. And as I've noted, we're currently eating more staple foods per capita per day than ever before. We are voracious with our food. Here's the example. So, where was it? 2012, global consumption of grain exceeded production following a bountiful peak harvest in 2011. We are currently eating into our reserves of grain stock globally. And that's not like a massive silo where there is actual grain stored, but just the predicted amount of yield versus what we can sort of keep aside. It is also worth noting that 90% of the world's food supply comes from 15 staples. The chart in the bottom right is an example of where things are produced and where they're shipped out to. So there is a network of production and supply that affects global consumption. Maize is the highest consumed staple. Rice shortly after that. So imagine, let's say, something hits one of these staples. Strange disease. I mean, there will be regional, but even a regional disease or a regional crop failure in, these highly water-stressed areas in Southeast Asia can have massive trigger-on effects for the ability to feed the world. Vietnam, for example, provides 10% of the world's rice supply for consumption. The grain fed to livestock alone in the US is sufficient amounts to eat 840 million people if they were to have a plant-based diet. The grain fed to the livestock in the US alone. The map on the bottom left, daily caloric intake per capita. As you can see, caloric intake very much correlates to the affluence of nations. A West versus the rest problem. Again, this is foreshadowing into next week about sustainability. Part of food security is how much energy does it take to make food? This notion of return of energy versus the investment of energy is also a key factor during actual energy production. But in food, we're talking about people's lives. Currently, there are about 4 billion people on plant-based diets, so eating less than 150 grams of meat a day. 2 billion on meat-rich diets. There is a significant difference in the amount of carbon dioxide emitted from those diets just through production and transport and etc. Meat-rich diets estimated produce 7.2 kilograms of carbon dioxide per day versus 3.8 kilograms of carbon dioxide for plant-based diets. It takes 25 kilocalories of fossil fuels to make 1 kilocalorie of protein energy versus 2.2 kilocalories of fossil fuels for the same in plant protein. So, how much water is used in producing these things? Well, there's a lovely little chart for you. Beef is pretty obscene for water usage. We use 15.5 thousand litres per kilogram of beef, 3.9 thousand litres per kilogram for rice, 3.4 thousand litres per kilogram for rice, 1.3 for wheat, 1,000 litres per kilogram for milk, and 200 litres per kilogram for eggs. One of the things I tend to mention is that eggs and, in fact, goat's milk are two of the most sustainable sources of protein. You can also use them in urban farming. You just have to be careful about where you're getting them from if you're conscientious about their consumption. And here we have the riposte back to those water security issues. So when I said half the world's population is supplied in the southeast, half the world's population lives in this sector of the world, we're also talking about a population fed from one river point, which was the Brahmaputra River. 85% of Pakistan's food comes from the Indus River, and 5 of the Indus tributaries cross the Indian territory before they arrive in Pakistan. Now, I'll go a little bit more into this during the climate change, but for example, they have a water treaty, and it's a fixed amount of water. But as climate change makes the amount of water availability worse, the fixed amount of water that India gets versus Pakistan proportionally changes. So the majority of what I will talk about now is energy, predominantly oil and other carboniferous forms of energy. A lot of what we understand about oil comes from this book called The Prize by Daniel Yergin, who did this massive study showing how oil since the 19th century has fundamentally changed the shape of nations, politics, economics, international power, the prize. He talks about us as being in the age of the hydrocarbon man. So again, that return on investment is key to understanding energy extraction. We're not limited by the sheer availability of fossil fuels. We are not limited by its abundance. We are limited by the cost effectiveness of extraction. In order to be a viable for our economic sufficiency, the amount of money spent to extract oil versus, or any energy, versus the amount of money we get back from that needs to be a 3-to-1 ratio. The biggest limiter to that is storage, not the actual extraction itself. Things like oil and gas, because it's just you stick a hose in the ground, get stuff out, it's expensive overheads to set up, but once they're set up, it's pretty cheap to maintain. You just turn on a tap and it comes out. However, as energy gets scarcer and scarcer, in principle, the price of that energy goes up and up, which means the return on investment suddenly becomes profitable for things that weren't profitable before. And so we see things like fracking come into play. Unconventional forms of energy. It's more expensive, but because energy is now more expensive in terms of its profitability, it becomes viable economically speaking. So there are 3 solutions to this energy crisis. Conventional renewables, which most of you should be familiar with, includes solar, wind, hydro, tidal, and biofuel. The main limiter to those is storage is still yet to prove, or is on the cusp of proving cost effective. We are actually undergoing a bit of a battery revolution at the moment, largely driven by Tesla and others. So I'm largely optimistic for this reason and this reason alone. We may, in fact, see the phasing out of fossil fuels in the next 10, 15 years. The other obvious solution is unconventional extraction, which, example, fracking, shale oil, etc. That is not concerned about the damage done. It's only concerned about the cost of energy. And the last one is innovation. So, I don't know, maybe we'll get cold fusion. But we've been maybe getting cold fusion for about 20 years, 30 years, something now. We do have some really interesting innovations around the stellarameter that was turned on last year in Germany, which is a very powerful thermonuclear reactor. So there are some interesting innovations being done. So many of those I will talk about in 2 weeks' time. So part of this is what's known as Hubbert's peak theory. Hubbert wrote in the 1950s trying to make observation of the US's energy supply, US's oil supply. Part of the observation is that when energy sources start running out, they won't taper off, but instead they'll dramatically plummet. This is the peak. So what he describes is as you start getting access to that cheap energy, because it's so cheap and new, and all the innovation is happening there, there's an acceleration of new rigs, there's an acceleration of new discoveries. But at a certain point, because that is accelerating and the resource itself is finite, the level of depletion is going to overtake the level of production. And because you're still trying to extract at that same rate, it will fall off a cliff. So we sometimes talk about that as the energy cliff. The question of peak oil is therefore a big geopolitical question. In the 1970s, they reached peak oil based on US production alone, and it produced stagflation, or one of the factors contributing to it. There are other things. But when your oil and your energy suddenly becomes expensive, your cost of living goes up. Everything is affected. So for oil, pessimistic estimates have already suggested we've hit peak and we're on the decline now. Optimistic ones, depends on who you ask, will range anywhere from 2026 up to 2047. But even the most optimistic one is not seeing us past 2050 for a growth of oil. And oil is the most energy-rich resource of the three main hydrocarbons that we tend to extract. Coal is a little bit harder to estimate, largely because there's a slightly smaller market for it. So potentially anywhere from 2011, roughly somewhere between 2025, 2035. The reason the peak is earlier is because it's more expensive generally to extract coal. The only reason we have an industry in Australia is because of the subsidies that the Australian government provides to transport to make it an economical venture. So what does this mean for geopolitics? Well, I'm going to show you largely the US roadmap to energy independence, the Chinese roadmap to energy independence, and a little bit about how Russia's interaction with the Caucasus is relevant to these. So the three areas that you've already looked at. For some of my students, there's a little bit of repeat going on. So the US's energy independence has largely been a plan since roughly the early 2000s because they have a very strong military mandate in terms of how their foreign policy is governed. If you remember Krauthammer's unipolar moment, if you remember all the sorts of rationales in Brzezinski's great plan, they require a very strong military presence, and that requires a lot of energy. The US Department of Defense is the single largest consumer of energy in the world. The US's strategy has been somewhat internal, maximizing on unconventional energy sources. Fracking is one of the bigger growing sectors of energy in the US. So the green lines are gas pipelines, black are oil pipelines. And as you can see, we have a lot of interaction with the massive aquifer in the middle. So primarily, the US's response to energy security has been to go internal and drill, baby, drill. So to quote Palin. This is the price of crude oil. Now, if you remember, the price of crude oil massively impacts its affordability and its extraction rates. We have a tank in 2008 for why? Global financial crisis. We had a tank last year, and what was that one for? OPEC. So a petroleum consortium, which as a global entity regulates the prices of oil. They're a massive conglomerate agreement partly to ensure that the price of oil stays high so that these other unconventional extraction methods stay viable. Saudi Arabia last year decided to oversupply the market. They went in, rather than reducing the amount of output to keep the price high, supply and demand basically going on, they said, nope, we're not going to get on board with you, OPEC. We're going to continue producing at the massive rates that we're currently producing. And that flooded the market. So you can largely thank Saudi Arabia's attempt to undermine its energy competitors for the cheap gas prices and cheap petrol prices that started last year. It's something of a mixed curse and blessing because their attempt, while it has seen the foreclosure of a lot of fracking industries in the US and has hit Russia, it has also driven them to be a little bit more intense about their attempts to acquire new forms of energy. So most of the fracking wells, most of the big ones have survived because, as I said, they've already paid the installation costs. Now they're just riding on the benefits of those monies. I actually had a very interesting conversation with the grandson of the inventor of fracking about 2 years ago. And the world perspective that he lives in is one where we will always innovate ourselves out of these problems. There are no finite limits. Okay, problem to water security. Well, massive desalination plants. And we will look at some of those 2 weeks' time. China's response has very much been external. You would have seen probably through about the Strait of Malacca a couple of weeks ago, 82% of China's oil imports comes through that Strait of Malacca. They are building massive pipelines into Kazakhstan and other sort of oil export areas. 2013, President Xi went on a tour of Central Asia to secure energy agreements, secure trade agreements with this region, partly to circumvent the need for China to draw energy through the Strait of Malacca, etc. Interestingly enough, patronizing, we see there's big relationships going on to the development of the Chinese Development Bank, I forget the name, sorry, and other energy producing countries such as Iran, Sudan, and South Sudan. Part of those negotiations have been a supply of weapons. And I'm going to go into the very strong interconnected links between militarization, weapons, and security for oil. And here again is a lovely map which shows you the Great Plan. I describe this to my classes as almost something of a manifest destiny. You have the eastern seaboard of China stretching its infrastructure out towards the Central Asia, roads, rail, oil and gas pipelines. Here's where energy gets complicated. So this concept is known as the resource curse. There is an observation that was made by Sachs and Warner in 1995, which says, counterintuitively, nations that have an abundance in resources generally perform poorly on growth. There is a strong correlation, or strong inverse correlation. This was first observed in the 19th century in the Netherlands, a phenomenon known as the Dutch disease, where they had a massive discovery of gas fields in their nation. Without having to go into the economics too much, basically when your country gains access to massive resources and massive wealth, it inflates the value of your currency. This impacts your ability to buy and sell competitively with other nations because your currency is just more valuable. What tends to happen is those sectors that are not tethered to this resource extraction shrink because they can't sell as much goods internationally. But rather than the jobs lost from those shrinking sectors being replaced by the growing sector, they are not replaced. Because typically, resource extraction is a highly automated process, does not require as much labor to gain the profits. It's literally like sticking a hose in the ground, getting your wealth out of the ground, completely disconnected from intensive labor. In fact, one of the reasons why there has been a push for renewables, including solar, etc., is because they are more labor intensive and would potentially offset some of this problems when you are trying to extract resources. We can see some of the more geopolitical effects of this with the Caucasus. Russia's energy relationship with Central Asia is very, very tight. The economic situation for these Central Asian nations is also quite dependent on Russia's economy. If Russia's economy slows, all of these places are hit. And again, this is a little bit of repeat for my tute, but we have remittances, which you covered last week. 90% of the remittances for Armenia, the Kyrgyz Republic, and Tajikistan come from people working in Russia. And for Tajikistan, half of the nation's revenue is remittances. Russia is the primary purchaser of manufactured goods from this region. So if Russia's economy slows down, its ability to purchase the goods from these areas slows down, and these are the primary job growth sectors in this region. Russia's financial sector is also highly insulated from other financial areas of the world, but deeply connected to here. Oil is a volatile market. Because of that volatility, there is another phenomenon observed called petroaggression. Petroaggression is an observed phenomenon where particularly developing nations that have this resource abundance and have high levels of civil unrest are much more belligerent internationally than others. So we have that more foundational stuff from Homer Dixon, who was noticing those resource scarcities have a high correlation to civil conflict. If we look at the Syrian crisis, while there were factors of civil unrest in the area, the climate change-induced droughts precipitated that into more violent and direct conflict because of starvation, people mass migrating out of rural areas into the city. As far as we can tell, there's not necessarily a higher indices of conflict through energy and oil resources compared to other kinds of scarcity. But oil does have more pernicious effects. So Michael Ross, for example, noted that petro-wealthy nations have less democracy and less economic stability and more frequent civil wars than those countries without oil. And Jeff Colgan observed that petro-revolutionary states, so states with access to oil, but also revolutionary fervor, are 240% more likely to instigate international conflict. Strong correlations to belligerence internationally and the possession of resources. Part of this is that resource curse. If your wealth is coming out of the ground as a nation, your revenue and profits are not dependent on your relationship with your people. You don't have to provide services, you're not taxing them for revenue. Again, you're just sticking a hose in the ground and reaping the benefits, disconnected from the population. However, it's not just a problem for developing nations. The perniciousness of oil politics goes pretty much everywhere. But to begin with, we see structural effects of oil revenue dependency on military buildup. And this was a report that came out last week by Professor Brenda Schaefer. One of their reports noted that volatile states that have oil revenue dependent, the oil revenue impacts the military buildup in 4 particular ways. So you have a surplus of wealth, and because of the volatility, it tends to encourage those nations to do short-term acquisitions. So buy large profits, buy large weapons, rather than investing that profit into, infrastructure, the manufacturing base that could easily be converted into a military industrial complex if you needed it. Again, we see this tends to encourage short-term solutions rather than long-term solutions. So the first 2 points are kind of interrelated. One of it is an investment strategy. The other is how it sort of interacts with the security dilemma. The third is the volatility of oil tends to directly impact internal power struggles, because there's basically a whole bunch of patronage and favors and private loyalties going on. When the profits from those tank, internal struggles. The report observed that this was a phenomenon present both in West Africa and the Middle East. However, we can also see similar effects when we look at, for example, the US. John mentioned Michael Clare, and Michael Clare's argument was America's foreign policy is dominated by oil interests, particularly making observations of the Gulf War and making observations of the Iraq War with Bush. Another study that came out 2 years ago, Gillens and Page, argued that American public policy, so domestic, more accurately reflects the interests of oil conglomerates than it does reflect the interests of the public. And their surmise was that America is actually an oligarchy. So influential is the US oil lobby that it has captured the democratic process there. And the final main phenomenon I want to look at is the carbon trap, which again affects developing nations more than it does developed nations. Paul Collier observed in 2007 that the carbon trap is a corollary of that resource curse. So where you have nations who have this abundance of resources, they tend to not get out of low levels of poverty for the reasons I mentioned before. The revenue of those nations is less dependent on services to the people, so they're less accountable to the people. The biggest growing sector of their economies are the primary extraction, which is labor light. There is a high correlation between internal corruption and petro-wealth for a lot of these reasons. Saudi Arabia is currently undergoing something of a crisis. 95 to 99% of its revenue is oil extraction, to the point where it basically gives almost free petrol to its citizens. That's how ludicrously wealthy Saudi Arabia has become. A lot of the way it sort of manages conflict domestically is through bribes and payouts, through local authorities. Saudi Arabia is expected to go bankrupt somewhere between 2015 to 2030 because of peak oil, because of the volatility of the market. And they're already trying to restructure right now. Like, they've cancelled the petrol subsidies to its citizens, which is causing no level of unrest. Sridrisha and Indawillik have also made an observation that petro-wealth dependent nations are invariably the most carbon-intense emitters. They are carboniferous economies. They have massive forms of incentive to maintain high levels of emission. They're also the most resistant to decarbonization. The four things they observed is their emissions are based on their extraction wealth. The extraction is that, once your industry becomes so big, the other industries suddenly shrink, and there's no more labor. And just the weakening of incentives all over. And this final map and this final slide I have for you is something of a picture which shows where these types of instabilities are occurring. Now, while we don't have the same kind of civil instability in a lot of these sort of Western nations, I would argue that a lot of that is because they have redirected their instability offshore. So yes, the US may be particularly stable internally, for a given value of stability, but it is certainly implicated in a lot of the instability in the Middle East. It has interests in Latin America. So all of these come together to create a very interesting world picture of how oil influences politics from the ground up.